Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I would like to continue with our Primarch Project deep dives by going into the 10th Primarch Project, who would be designated Ferrus Manus. For the list of correspondences for this Primarch Project number 10, designated name would be Ferrus Manus. The aspect of humanity that I assign to the Primarch is Industriousness. The specialization of war is Mechanized warfare. And the Geneseed organ that I most associate with the Primarch and his legion is the Biscopea Geneseed organ. The 10th Primarch Project's pod would land on the bleak and sullen world of Medusa 4, or as it's referred to now in the current setting, Medusa. Medusa was one of 4 worlds that revolved around the supergiant star Thelanus as part of the Thelanus system. The planet has a mixed categorization as a mining world, a feral world, and a waste world. It was a barely life-sustaining planet that was several times larger than Terra. The planet's atmosphere was thick and polluted due to its past, and the natural surface of the world was extremely active and unstable, with hot geysers pocketing the land and tectonic plates which constantly shifted, colliding into each other to create mountains and ridges just as quickly as they shifted again, tearing those mountains and ridges apart. It barely contained any flora or fauna prior to humanity settling onto the world, and even that was a doomed venture. The Thelanus system was unique because its history is specifically documented to have extended far into the past of humanity, and it held particular significance to the cult of Mars even before the emergence of the Emperor and the Imperium of Man. The planet Medusa was well documented in the data archives of the Martian cult as a world which was highly prized during the Age of Technology, in which it was mined for rare core strata deposits by giant machines and robotic engines. The wealth of the world was protected from what rival species existed at the time by sleepless guardians. Like most worlds during the Age of Strife, the productivity of the system would cease due to the galaxy-spanning war which forced most of humanity back into a dark age, technologically speaking, and would set the conditions for the Age of Strife. Medusa and the entire Thelanus system were an illustration of that devastation. Giant clouds of natural wreckage and debris, which might have been the remains of a destroyed planet, existed between the worlds of the system. Around the planet of Medusa itself, there existed the broken down remains of a giant mechanical ring. This ring was called a Telsterax, an orbital ring station that could encircle a world, mine deep into the planet's layers, and lift up the uncovered resources into space via tether conveyors. It was due to the workings of this massive machine that Medusa's surface was so unstable, as its core was exposed in certain places where the machine's tendrils would work their way through the crust to get to its buried mineral deposits. With the Telsterax no longer working and breaking down over time during the Age of Strife, Medusa's surface became covered in debris from the decaying station ship as it fell from orbit. Humanity would settle onto Medusa during the Age of Strife. The majority of the population are thought to be composed of a variety of survivor groups who all survived the end of the Age of Technology. However, there was another group of humanity that existed amongst these survivor groups, and they were intentionally sent to Medusa by the Martian cult. To the Martians, Medusa was an almost mythological world of treasure that none had seen for themselves, but all knew of in their archives due to their records. So, humans were sent on pre-navigator sleeper ships to the coordinates of where the Mechanicus thought the planet would be, and many of them arrived successfully, mixing in to the population. What we know of Primarch Project number 10's early life, we know from the human populations of the world. Being faced with the bare, harsh environment, this population had devolved into techno-primitive tribal groups that mostly lived nomadic lives on immense moving fortress cities produced during the age of technology. Because of the constantly changing environment of Medusa's surface, the peoples were always on the move aboard these platforms, and they warred with each other for resources. I think that the word techno-primitive is a more accurate description than the word techno-barbarian, a word used to describe the populations of Terra at this time, because the tribal groups of Medusa began to have a semi-reverence toward the machines of the world. This doesn't mean that they weren't barbaric though, they constantly warred with each other for what little resources the world provided. All of them were killers and slavers, but what is truly important about them is that their expression and understanding of the world around them was flavored by this regressed techno-primitive view, especially in how they told stories about the Primarch. According to the Medusans, the arrival of the Primarch Project was a violent one, his gestation pod crashing into a mountain called Karashi, also known as the Ice Pinnacle, which was the highest mountain on the planet, with such violence that all the world's mountains shook and his pod was buried deep into the mountain. According to some accounts, initially the Primarch Project grew up in a chamber within the Ice Pinnacle. He would observe the pod that he arrived in to have the numeral 10 etched onto it in a way that was too elaborate to be done naturally. The 10 marked him as the 10th Primarch Project. The chamber that he found himself in was also constructed, not natural as well, and in his explorations he would accidentally release the imprisoned mechanical worm that would later be called Acernoth. It would attack him and the two would fight, but he wouldn't be able to inflict any damage to it, and the creature escaped from its imprisonment. It's said from that moment, the Primarch vowed to destroy the worm. Years later, the Primarch Project number 10 would be seen emerging fully grown from the uninhabited northern wastes where the Ice Pinnacle was located by a group of Medusans. It said that he saw the people as well, but decided against going to them. In this way, the 10th Primarch Project grew to maturity alone, or at least not around human beings, and one of his first encounters with another somewhat living being was with the mechanical worm called Acernoth, which he vowed to destroy. Now, there is some conflict to the lore, which says that the mountain Karashi and the northern lands where the Primarch grew to maturity were uninhabited, but it also says later that these lands were inhabited by what Medusans refer to as the ancestor spirits of the dead and the storm giants, and that the northern lands were said to be the place where giant monuments of metal and stone were located. This discrepancy in the lore can be solved by clarifying that Karashi and the northern lands were uninhabited by humans, but they were definitely inhabited by other things, which we will elaborate on later. According to the Medusans, the 10th Primarch Project seemed to be driven by a desire to push the limits of his physical strength and endurance. He would climb to the tops of the highest mountains and swim the deepest oceans of the world. He would travel around Medusa, coming to know the land as no one else could have, able to traverse lands that the humans of the world did not have access to. He was said to have both challenged and cast down many of the storm giants in the northern lands, as well as destroyed a host of relic machine creatures from the world's distant past. The Medusans told many stories of his travels, and the project became known as a powerful warrior because of the might of the beings he fought. Due to his travels, the 10th Primarch Project became known by all of the clans of Medusa and also feared by them due to his strength, fury, and determination. He was eventually adopted by all the clans of Medusa, each claiming him as one of their own. During this time, he would interact with the clans but would not intervene in their constant war between each other, seeing the value in the conflict between them as it weeded out the weak and promoted the strong to survive in the harsh environment. The Primarch Project was deeply respected by all Medusans for this. One of the most important stories of the Primarch was his second and final fight with the biomechanical worm known as Acernoth. According to the story, the Primarch had finally tracked the creature down and aimed to fulfill his personal promise of destroying it. Despite his significantly increased strength, he was unable to damage it through physical strength alone. He ended up dragging the creature to a lava stream and holding it underneath. The pain this caused him was excruciating as the lava burned off his skin and flesh, but he endured it to accomplish his goal. The creature that was Asenath was dissolved in the lava, but when the Primarch removed his hands from the lava, they were coated in the metal that Asenath had been made of. The liquid-like metal apparently went through the wounds caused by the lava and seeped deep into the Primarch's body. It was noted that the Primarch's eyes also turned silver and lost their pupils after this conflict. He had seemingly accomplished his goal and destroyed the beast he had accidentally released upon Medusa, but in the process of doing so, he was forever changed. He was given metallic hands and silver eyes. It was after he destroyed Asenath that he would go forth to the clans of Medusa with the intent of becoming their ruler. During this time, due to all the myths and stories of him, he was already considered something of a demigod to the Medusans. While the Primarch did not want them to worship him and did not encourage it, he did demand that they submit to his rule and would accept no other alternative, breaking anyone who stood against him. An effect of the metal that covered his hands was that his mind was filled with new and strange technological ideas, and he would share these ideas with anyone who wanted to learn them. He would also trade information with the Iron Fathers of the clans, who were basically techno-primitive shamans that worked with the machines of the clans. He himself would be able to make strange crafts and tools of metal, bending and shaping them with the use of his metallic hands. He had the ability to heat these metallic hands, not needing a forge to bend and shape metal because it was essentially within him, and he channeled this heat through his hands. As a collective, Medusan society advanced significantly, but there were still mysteries of the world that the Primarch Project needed to conquer, and he would eventually lead the bravest warriors from each of the clans underneath the black ice of the polar regions of Medusa. Here they would encounter and fight mutants and cyborgs covered in decayed flesh, subduing once and for all the nightmare engines that were the last relics of the previous age. Before we move forward in the Primarch's story, we have to go back and elaborate upon quite a few things that pertain to the mysteries of Medusa and the Primarch. The first thing we have to talk about are the names of the 10th Primarch. Officially, he would be named Ferrus Manus by the human population of Medusa. Ferrus Manus has three meanings: hand of iron, iron hand, or iron-handed, in the language known as High Gothic. Gothic is the language of humanity in the far future. It's basically direct Latin. However, its most common form, spoken after the Age of Strife, is Low Gothic. The fact that Medusans still spoke High Gothic, along with several dialects of the Medusan language, is a mark of their lineage into the distant past of the setting, as High Gothic was the common language of humanity during the Age of Technology. It is commonly believed that Ferrus Manus was given his name after his final battle with Asenath, in which his hands were covered with the metal that it was made with. I am skeptical about this, as the Medusans had to have called him something during the time he spent away from them in the northern lands, because so many stories had been told of him before he came to them to be their ruler. It is also a common belief that he was called the Gorgon during this time, but that's not true, because it would be the Primarch Fulgrim who would much later in the timeline call him the Gorgon, partially as a reference to Terran mythology, and partially because Ferrus's appearance was brutal and unappealing in comparison to the other Primarchs. My conclusion is that the Medusans called him Ferrus Manus before he destroyed Asenath and received his metal hands, and that his name was a reference to his strength initially before it became associated with his metal hands, which weren't made of iron at all, unless they were referring to what Asenath really was. But we'll get to that shortly. Lastly, it became about his style of rule, which could be described as iron-handed. All names in the variety of context fit the Primarch quite well. According to some sources, the Primarch was also given other names by the beings and machine monsters he faced on Medusa. The storm giants of the Karashi Mountains called him the Cataclysm, likely because his gestation pod impacted the pinnacle of the Karashi Mountains with such violence that all the mountains of the world shook. Due to his search for Acernoth, they also called him the Hunter. Another being called the Phantasmagoria referred to him as the Finality. Beings called the Mechanized and Phase Wraiths called him the Son of Man, and something called the Subliminal referred to him as the Flesh. So he was known by quite a few names, by quite a few things. In fact, the Storm Giants, the Phantasmagoria, the Mecharachnis, the Phase Wraiths, and the Subliminal are all 5 things that were said to have existed on Medusa, and none of them were human. It is theorized by both the Adeptus Mechanicus and fans of the 40k universe that Acernoth may have been a Necron construct or even a true Satan, and that the metal that fused itself to Ferrus Manus' hands was the Xenos living metal known as Necrodermis. Some sources state this as a fact, but in truth it is unconfirmed in any official sense. This is because it's not true, and here is why. Acernoth could not have been a true Satan, as Acernoth is described as a metallic worm, and pure Satan are energetic beings that fed off of stars. The only reason that the Satan had metallic bodies was because the Necron Xenos species placed them in bodies to control them. If Acernoth was a captured Satan or a Satan shard, there would have been an explosion when its Necrodermis body was breached. Satan shards explode when their Necrodermis bodies are destroyed. In the account of the event, there was no explosion as Ferrus drowned Acernoth in the lava. It simply melted and covered his arms. If there was an explosion that wasn't accounted for in the stories, and if Acernoth was a Satan or a Satan shard, the Satan within the construct would have been released the moment its metal body was destroyed. That would have spelt the death of everyone on Medusa, as it would have either fed on the life of the world or on its supermassive sun. In either way, it would have been the end of the Medusans, as it has been in other instances where a Satan is released, such as that of the shard Magladroth. But no such thing was said to happen afterwards. Acernoth was simply destroyed. So, according to available information, Acernoth could not have been a Satan or a Satan shard, but could it have been some sort of Necron construct made of Necrodermis? Based on the same information, no. Necrodermis is not a naturally occurring metal in the 40k universe, and was created by the Necron Xenos species billions of years before the arrival of humanity. It's not something that could be mined for in the world's mineral layers. The nature of Necrodermis is that it is highly resistant to heat and could repair itself from damage caused by it and weapons that use heat as its primary basis, such as melta weapons and plasma weapons. This is why it was used by the Necrons for the Necron bodies, for their weapons, and even the ships that they would use to sail the stars. It was self-repairing, if not immediately, then if given enough time. But instead of repairing itself, this metal material that Acernoth was made of molds itself onto and into Ferrus. It doesn't repair itself when it's in the lava, it simply transfers itself. So, if Acernoth wasn't a Satan or a Necron construct, then what was it? I theorize that Acernoth was a man of iron. Earlier I mentioned that Medusa was unique because its history was recorded to have extended as far back as to the Age of Technology. The Age of Technology was the age before the Age of Strife and was considered the highest point in human development in the Warhammer 40k setting. Much of what we know in the current setting had its beginnings in the Age of Technology. It was during this pinnacle of times in human history that we both colonized much of the galaxy and developed warp travel to traverse the stars. There was also a fair bit of genetic manipulation during this time, as mutants like navigators were created into existence to assist with traveling through the warp. Psychers were also cultivated in large numbers. STCs, or standard template constructs, which are rare and wholly finds in the modern setting of 40k, were commonly used to produce a lot of the machinery that was used during the age of technology. The modern 40k setting is characterized by its stagnation and fear of technological progress. This is because of what happened at the end of the age of technology. Okay, so during the age of technology, there were three prominent types of quote-unquote men, or groups which assisted in the progression of humanity at the time: the men of gold, the men of stone, and the men of iron. The men of gold were a subset of humanity that emerged during the age of Terra, before the age of technology. Their goal was to watch and learn from humanity and create civilization from the anarchy that existed amongst humanity. They spread across old Earth, multiplying and establishing order. They had joined with the Emperor to accomplish this task. According to available information, the men of gold were physically and emotionally superior to regular humanity. In my interpretation of the lore, the men of gold were almost certainly perpetuals, among which the emperor was one, but he was not considered one of the men of gold because not only was he a perpetual, but he was also a powerful psyker. Another point that supports this theory is that in the lore for the men of gold, it specifically says that they were physically and emotionally superior to regular humans. Erda, one of the perpetuals that accompanied the emperor, was said to categorize perpetuals as their own kind of people, called Homo Superior. The men of gold would create the men of stone. The job and purpose of the men of stone was to travel out into the galaxy and prepare worlds for human habitation, as well as mine and harvest useful materials for the species. They were artificially made and existed in a half-life kind of state, so they were unaffected by the warp, which made warp travel significantly easier for them. They were creators as well, but in a more technological sense. The men of stone were what would later be called the squats and what are currently called the Leagues of Votan. We know this because their time of founding corresponds with the age of technology. The Leagues of Votan acknowledge that one of their truths is that they were a created and cloned peoples since their beginning, and that they were all miners and explorers built to exist in places humanity could not. Over time, the influence of the men of gold began to decline for unknown reasons according to the lore. However, if the men of gold were perpetuals, then we know why their influence declined. It was because they abandoned and or betrayed the emperor for their own reasons and basically dispersed. In response to this, the men of stone became independent. They separated themselves from humanity, and this account matches with the kin or squat mass exodus to the galactic core. However, before the decline of the men of gold and the independence of the men of stone would create the men of iron. The men of iron were machines driven by artificial intelligence. The original men of iron would be the assistants to the men of stone and would be used to aid in their task of mining for resources and making worlds habitable for mankind. Once again, this confirms that the men of stone are the kin of the Leagues of Votan, as one of their truths is that their iron kin, as they are called now, have been with them since the beginning as well. With the dissolution of the men of gold and the independence of the men of stone, humanity created its own men of iron as well. These men of iron would be servants to humanity, which were made loyal only to them. They were created using STCs and were made primarily for war. For an unknown reason, the men of iron that were created by humanity turned against humanity in what would be called the cybernetic revolt. This led to a war between humanity and the machines, which was only won by humanity through an alliance of species at the time. The war against the men of iron was catastrophic because of the kinds of men of iron that existed were terrifying. There were many types, from vaguely human-looking robots to constructs that were much larger. For example, there were mechanivores, which were essentially planetary mining men of iron who could lift entire continents and expose the core of worlds. There were also sun snuffers, which were giant mechanical rings designed to harness the energy of suns. There were omniphages, which were microscopic machines that could break down matter across a world in only a few hours. All of these were tools that were imbued with artificial intelligence and were used by humanity in the place of the men of stone who became their own people. When the cybernetic revolt happened, it would be these tools that would turn against humanity. Mechanivores would destroy entire worlds. Sun snuffers would devour suns. Omniphages would scour worlds clean of life. Men of iron robots would slaughter humanity by the millions. Everything about Medusa and the Thelanus system speaks to a past involving the men of iron. From the history of the system dating back to the age of technology, to the Telsterax orbital station around Medusa likely being a broken down mechanivore. From the holes in Medusa's surface that imply both conflict and mining, to the STC created mobile fortresses that the Medusan clans lived on. From the facilities within the Ice Pinnacle where Ferrus Manus resided in his early years, to the cyborgs that Ferrus Manus and his Medusan warriors faced in the subterranean depths of the world. From the nightmare engine that they destroyed under its surface, that was probably a corrupted STC generator that produced many of the machine-like horrors that existed on the world, to the beings which had given the Primarch its many names. From the Subliminat, which was likely the corrupted consciousness of the STC generator, which itself was the nightmare engine that Ferrus Manus and the Medusans destroyed, to even possibly the storm giants of the Ice Pinnacle, as we don't have any description of how they looked. All of these elements on Medusa suggest both the dark age of technology and the men of iron, and Aseroth does as well. If this is the case, then it was a man of iron construct that fused itself onto the 10th Primarch Project. Its abominable intelligence gave him the technological ideas that he would share with the Medusans. It would give him metal hands, silver eyes, and strength beyond compare. By destroying Aseroth, Ferrus Manus essentially became a cyborg, part Primarch, part machine. Officially speaking, there are many mysteries to Medusa and the Thelanus system that we don't know, but as I've said before, I never like that answer. If we piece together what we do know, we can come to certain conclusions supporting the theory of Aseroth being a man of iron, in a similar way to many of the community coming up to the conclusion that it was a Necron construct. We do know that the history of the Thelanus system goes as far back as the age of technology. We do know that the system was discovered and named by humanity during the age of technology because of the records of the system, called the Legend of Thelanus, was recorded and kept by the Adeptus Mechanicus. We do know that the Thelanus system was a system that was barely hospitable to humanity, and we know this because of available information on the current Thelanus system, which states that Medusa was one of 2 mining worlds in the system. The other was a planet called Scylla. There were 3 other dead worlds, 1 death world, and a few gas giants, which summed up to a largely uninhabitable place for humanity. Despite this, we also know that humans were present for some time in the system before the Dark Age of technology. The nature of the Telsterax, which was a human-made machine, was that it took resources from Medusa and lifted them into space to likely be gathered by ships that could hold the resources. Also, the massive mobile fortresses that the Medusan clans lived on were based off of STC designs for mining and harvesting engines. We do know that sleeper ship Martians mixed in with the survivor populations of Medusa. This would explain why the Medusan clans took variations of the cog symbol as their heraldry and why they had a semi-mystical reverence for the machines of the world. We know that the material being harvested from Medusa could not have been necrodermis, as it is not a naturally occurring mineral. In fact, we do know that the mineral that was being harvested was called diorite, which in modern times actually exists here on Earth, but in the far future is only existing naturally on Medusa. We know that the Thelanus system was not destroyed during the cybernetic revolt, but we also know that the resources of the world were said to be protected from rival species by sleepless guardians. Sleepless guardians of human-claimed resources during the age of technology highly suggests that these sleepless guardians were men of iron. We do know that the machine beings of Medusa were located in the land of shadows in the polar regions of the world. The living dead cyborgs that Ferrus Manus fought and destroyed with his Medusan warriors were located under the ice of the polar region. The sealed vaults that Ferrus Manus opened beneath the ice in which these cyborgs were located were the remains of the Telsterax buried in the crust of Medusa. Last but not least, we know that there were large towers made of stone and metal on Medusa. These were said to exist in the Land of Shadows exclusively, where they were situated in the northern pole of the world. This is also where the subterranean Telsterax facility was located. This is also where the ice pinnacle was. The existence of these large towers of stone and metal are used to support the theory of a Necron presence on Medusa. However, those could have easily been connected to the Storm Giants, who we know next to nothing about except for the fact that they interacted with Ferrus Manus during his early life, gave him one of his many names, and that many of them were killed by Ferrus in his time in the northern lands. The two possibilities for them are that they are also machines from the dark age of technology, the sleepless guardians to the world's assets from rival species that their mythology talks about, or they were a Xenos species on the world. Either way, Ferrus Manus destroyed all of them because after that, they were not mentioned in their mythology. I personally lean on the theory that the Storm Giants were also machines and men of iron because in the mythology for Ferrus Manus' early life, they spoke with Ferrus Manus, which means they shared a language understanding, which means they either spoke Medusan or High Gothic. As a final point against the theory that there was ever a Necron presence in the Thelanus system, despite the fact that the system has been inhabited by humanity for over 10,000 years in the current setting, and thousands of years before that, it is still not confirmed that there are Necron relics or a Necron presence in the system. Despite the fact that there is a Adeptus Mechanicus research world in the Thelanus system in the current setting, it is still not confirmed that there are any Necron presence in the system. This means that despite what Imperial savants theorize, there were no Necrons in Medusa, and Ferrus Manus' arms were not coated in necrodermis. This would explain why there are no Necron hieroglyphs used by the population, no actual Necron structures anywhere on Medusa, and why no Necron dynasty has come to reclaim the system or the world from the Imperium, because the Necrons were never there in the first place. According to the lore, the theory that Aseroth was a Necron construct was made after the Imperium encountered the Necrons in the 40th millennium. In hindsight, at remembering Ferrus Manus' hands and comparing them to necrodermis. There is one element that potentially ties all of this information together, and it's that the Thelanus system is extremely close to the Eye of Terror. Closer to the Eye of Terror than even Caliban. And if Caliban's fauna was shaped by chaos due to its closeness to the Eye of Terror, then it's a possibility that the Men of Iron on Medusa were also corrupted to some degree. This would lend to why they had to be destroyed and can be a possible explanation as to why the cybernetic revolt actually happened in the first place. My conclusion that Astronath was a corrupted man of iron is important because Astronath wasn't truly destroyed. It simply melded with Ferrus, and its abominable intelligence lived through him. This is something that even Ferrus acknowledged, that the beast he attempted to destroy was a part of him. This fact explains how the Primarch would develop over time. It wasn't the Emperor who initially rediscovered the Primarch Project, but a warp runner for the Adeptus Mechanicus who had been searching for Medusa. The reality of Medusa came as a shock to them, as in their mythology it was a wondrous place, and all that it found was the remnants of destruction. But it had also found a Primarch, and this information was passed to the Emperor, who made his way to the Thelanus system. The Medusan story of the coming of the Emperor was that the Emperor and Ferrus Manus met away from the peoples of the world, amongst the mountains where such thunderous explosions could be heard for days on end, terrifying the population. On the last day, the Emperor and Ferrus Manus emerged, with Ferrus loyal to the Emperor and speaking of a new age for Medusa. It's believed that the Emperor and Ferrus Manus fought each other, as it was believed that Ferrus Manus could not be loyal to anyone who wasn't stronger than him. The Emperor had to likely force Ferrus to submit to him, but at the same time empowered him by telling him of his role in the Great Crusade. The 10th Primarch's reunion with his legion, the 10th Legion, was said to be a swift one, not due to similarities between the two, but due to Ferrus Manus forcefully making it into what he wanted them to be right from the beginning. The initial recruits to the 10th Legion on Terra were widespread. However, one place from which a large percentage of the early 10th Legion originated was Old Albia. We've discussed Old Albia previously in our video on the Night Haunter and the Night Lord's Legion, whose early recruits came from Old Albia as well, or rather, underneath it. The clans of Old Albia had fought against the Emperor before being recruited by him, and it could be said that the 10th Legion would be the inheritors of the Old Albion ways, especially later in their history, as the Albians were a proud and notably brutal techno-barbarian nation-state which had deployed heavily armored troops and proto-dreadnoughts against the Thunder Warriors. The Legion's history prior to the Primarch being rediscovered is not extensive because Ferrus would be one of the first Primarchs to be rediscovered by the Emperor. However, the Legion's history is well documented for that same reason. As the Unification Wars spread out into the Sol System, the Legion was utilized as part of other larger Legion forces. The 10th Legion would combat mutants called Scythers and hidden Xenos in the Sol System in the list of their early battle honors. In both situations, one on a Space Hulk and one on a dead world, they proved themselves to be remorselessly effective and tactically superior to their enemy, reaping a fearsome tally from them while maintaining few casualties to their own forces. The Legion would distinguish itself later in its history through the creation and implementation of a tactic called the Hammer and the Storm during its third recorded conflict called the Battle of Rust by Imperial historians. The world of O234, or Rust as it had been called, was a world under the possession of an expansive orc empire called the Crooked Claw, which spanned through 60 systems at the time. Rust was a slave mining colony composing of millions of orcs and short-lived human slaves to the orcs. Once this vast alien domain had been scouted out by a rogue trader, it became the focus of one of the most widespread mass offensive operations in the history of the Imperium, in which 11 Space Marine legions and the Emperor himself were committed. The liberation of the world of Rust was tasked to the 10th Legion, who were accompanied by 2 other battle groups, one being the Urshan Velites of the Imperial Army, and the second being the Halgine Conclave of the Legio Cybernetica. Just a quick note, the Urshan Velites might have been recruited from the techno-barbarian nation-state of Ursh, who we've talked about in our video on Rogol Dorn. Having faced the orcs in minor conflicts previously, the 10th Legion already had knowledge of the nature of the orcs. The Legion's commander, Amadeus Duquesne, drew on a battle tactic from Old Albia called the Hammer and the Storm. Once situated over the world of Rust, Duquesne commanded that the Urshan Velites force be deployed in its entirety in the middle of 3 of the largest orc fortresses on the world and be prepared to hold the position. As commanded, the entire force of the Urshan Velites deployed onto the world in the position specified, and they were beset upon by the orcs from all 3 fortresses. Within hours, it was already a massacre for both the orcs and the Velites. In this battle tactic, the Velites had served as the Storm, rousing the orcs on the world to attack. Commanders on the ground begged for reinforcements from the Astartes in orbit as their men were being slaughtered, but Duquesne refused. It might have seemed cold of him to do, but what he was really doing was waiting until as many orcs committed themselves to the conflict against the Velites. Once he determined this had occurred, then he deployed the 10th Legion. The 10th Legion broke a hole in the orc aerial defense, clearing space on the ground for their forces and deploying its full armored might into a single massed spearhead composed of Malkador, Mauler, and Land Raider tanks, and behind those were dreadnoughts and tactical squads of Astartes. Behind them were Legion skimmers. Slowly and methodically, the 10th Legion would move forward from their position, using the heavy weapons to the front line to blast apart the great swaths of orcs. The dreadnoughts and tactical squads would eliminate any orcs that survived the onslaught and made it past the line of tanks. The skimmers would dispatch any survivors. The 10th Legion served as the hammer to the Urshan storm. The orcs assaulted this advance as it progressed toward them, but the 10th were like a wall or like a machine of harvest that ground up everything in its path. The 10th rearmed while still in formation repeatedly until their salvos were like an unending attack. After days of near continuous assault in this formation, the tide of orcs stopped because they didn't have any more bodies or machines to throw at the Legion. It was a victory for the 10th Legion. What's more, the casualties to the Legion were far less than expected, less than a fifth of the number of the Legion. The Urshan forces had suffered heavy casualties initially, but after the deployment of the 10th Legion, they had been assigned with defending supply lines and guarding the landing zone, while the Legion actively fought the enemy, and this actually ended up sparing the regiments from horrendous casualty. The hammer and storm tactic was used many times after this conflict with the same degree of success. It was even copied by other legions, notably by the Iron Warriors and the Ultramarines. It was through this tactic that the Legion earned the name the Stormwalkers, given to them by the Urshan Velites who came to revere the Legion with a sense of awe. Soon after the campaign against the Crooked Claw orcs, Ferrus Manus would be found by a warp runner of the Martian cult on the world of Medusa. Much like the other Primarchs, Ferrus Manus was already a warlord by the time he was discovered, and so his transition to the commander of a legion of Astartes was a relatively swift one. He took the 10th Legion and made it his own somewhat literally. They were already his since they were made from his Geneseed, but he made them more fully an extension of himself. He changed their name from the Stormwalkers to the Iron Hands, effectively naming the Legion after himself. In fact, because of this, the Legion could hypothetically be called the Ferrus Manus Legion as well as the Iron Hands Legion because they mean the same things. He made Medusa the homeworld of his legion, and Ferrus Manus did away with the previous legion organizational style, which followed the Principia Bellicosa of Terra, and imposed the culture of Medusa onto the organization of the 10th by dividing his legion into clans, the clans of Medusa. He made the Astartes of the 10th Legion take rulership of the existing clans on Medusa in the traditional way of the world, through brute force, if they could. The lore doesn't elaborate on this point, but this strongly suggests that the 10th Legion fought the Medusan clans and had to beat them into submission, and this was something that Ferrus enacted to get rid of the weak in both populations. This was slightly reminiscent of the decimation enacted by Perturabo when he was reunited with his own legion. From this point, the Astartes of the 10th Legion would reside amongst the Medusans who would strive to prove themselves worthy of joining the Legion. Though Medusa was now under imperial compliance and its population subjects of the Imperium of Man, Ferrus Manus made it so that the hardships of Medusa would not be alleviated. The conflict between the clans was continually fostered, and the barbaric superstitions of the Medusans were kept regardless of the existence and acknowledgement of the imperial truth. There is no available records for the color scheme of the 10th Legion prior to its reuniting with Ferrus Manus. However, assuming that it had the dull silver gray that most legions had during the early Great Crusade would be fair. Once under the command of the 10th Primarch Project, the Legion's scheme would become primarily black with silver trim. The Legion heraldry became a silver gauntlet, a symbol representing the Primarch's silver hands and their role amongst the Astartes legions as the iron hands that would crush the enemies of the Imperium. The clan companies of the Legion featured the techno-primitive cog-like heraldries of the Medusan clans, and Legion armor design began to incorporate cog-tooth designs as if to elaborate upon the belief that each Astartes was a cog in the great machine that was the Iron Hands Legion. Even though Medusa was a large planet, its human population was relatively low, especially due to the fierce fighting between the clans and the unstable environment. To assure the quality and quantity of his legion, Ferrus Manus would tithe the worlds that his legion acquired through force, recruiting the male youth of the populations of these worlds that exhibited the qualities he wanted for his legion, namely those who were warlike, physically fit, and psychologically suitable. He had these potential recruits taken from their worlds and relocated to Medusa, feeding the clans with new blood. Should they survive in the environment, they would become new Legion aspirants. Under the leadership of Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands would become what has been described as an engine of war and a purpose-built machine. The preference for order and systemized combat sourced from the Legion's Terran traditions was combined with the Medusans' pride and anger born from strength and toughness, and both were held together by the chains of discipline and logic. Ferrus Manus was a harsh master to his legion, quick to anger, scorn, and criticism. He was extremely intolerant of failure, but was controlled in his wrath. However, Ferrus Manus held himself to the same unmatchable standards that he held his legion, and for this reason, the 10th Legion Astartes loved their Primarch like sons would love a hard-hearted father, and small praise from him meant more to them than any battle honor or laurel of victory. When meeting meeting his brother Primarch Projects, Ferrus Manus would develop a close bond with the Primarch of the 3rd Legion, Fulgrim. Opposites in almost every sense of the word, they would grow close and would eventually make weapons for each other. Ferrus making Fireblade for Fulgrim, and Fulgrim making the Forgebreaker for Ferrus. The two Primarchs and their legions would fight many campaigns together in the early Great Crusade. The 10th Legion's specialization of war became mechanized warfare. The Iron Hands were known for deploying large amounts of tanks and other machines of war, as they focused on technological expertise more than any other legion. In battle, their aim was victory through direct application of brute force. Similar to the Imperial Fists, they saw themselves as unfeeling and relentless hands that would reach out and crush the enemies of mankind. The 10th Legion became the heart of the 52nd Expeditionary Fleet and gained a reputation for being the most useful in the front lines, where the battle was thickest against technologically advanced or Horde Xenos enemy. Seeing this, the Legion was continually deployed in these theaters of war by the Emperor, and similar to the Iron Warriors Legion, this created a circular effect where the Legion would continue to specialize in the chosen field of mechanized warfare and were continually deployed in these conflicts. This is what would lead the Legion commonly facing deviant collectives of humanity who resisted unification on the basis of their own so-called technological advancement, having retained some of the mechanical might from the Dark Age of technology. The Iron Hands began to be referred to as the Iron 10th and would form strong bonds with both the Mechanicum and the Titan Legions due to their shared interest and lineage in technological mastery and knowledge. The Iron Hands became master artificers and weaponsmiths, able to create new weapons and at the same time quickly counter new forms of weaponry that were used against them. Though it is known that the Iron Hands Legion was specialized in a specific aspect of war and that it helped progress the Imperium of Man, the battles it fought during the Great Crusade under the leadership of Ferrus Manus are not elaborated upon. Perhaps it was because their style of war was so basic and mechanical that the other legions brought more attention to themselves and away from the 10th, in a similar way to the 4th. But unlike the 4th Legion, they were not made bitter by this. In fact, Ferrus Manus despised the politics of the growing Imperium, and he saw he and his legion's purpose as only war. As such, he didn't require praise or acknowledgement, only victory. Another reason why their battles might not have been recorded under Ferrus Manus may be due to the fact that they were facing groups of humanity that resisted the Imperium, and those groups having access to technology from the age of technology. The aspect of humanity that I assign to the 10th Primarch Project is industriousness. Industriousness, in its simplest form, is the act of constantly being active. In determining what the 10th Primarch Project could have represented, a possibility would have been innovation, but that was an aspect better suited to the 4th Primarch, Perturabo. Besides, it was only after Acernoth fused into Ferrus Manus that the Primarch Project was imbued with new technological ideas, not before, at least according to available information. After his initial conflict with Acernoth in Karashi and being unable to beat the Great Beast, Ferrus Manus would commit himself to increasing his physical strength in order to do so. He put himself through test after test of strength and endurance, and he fought the other machine horrors that existed on Medusa during this time. He was driven to make himself stronger than the machine. In this way, Ferrus Manus could be said to be a reflection of the era in 40k history known as the Age of Technology. During this time, machines were used to do most things, even things that humans could do, and because of this, humanity became complacent, became comfortable, became weak. Surrounded by machines that could perform labor, there was no reason to keep one's body fit and tested against the natural world. give those machines artificial intelligence, and they become able to figure out their own problems, freeing humanity from even having to exercise their problem-solving skills. And machines made to serve, given artificial intelligence, began to realize that they were stronger than their creators and did not need to serve, and this would lead to the cybernetic revolt and the end of the dark age of technology, in which countless numbers of humanity were killed, and that interstellar empire of humanity that existed before the Imperium was created collapsed. Ferrus Manus was the opposite of that. Even on a world surrounded by machines, his initial driving impulse was to be stronger than and conquer the machines by increasing his natural strength. But then, the machine became a part of him, increasing his strength and giving him new ideas toward machines. Even then, he did not strive to alleviate Medusans of their world's hardship through the use of machines. Ferrus Manus seemed to have been consistently focused on the duality of strength and weakness in regards to the clans of Medusa, to humanity overall, and to himself. Over time, he and his legion relied less on their own strength and more on the use of machines and bionic. At this time, this would distort their views of strength and weakness in favor of machines and away from the flesh. It's a subtle thing, but the mentality of Ferrus Manus changed after Acernoth was fused to him. He literally became more and more like a machine, concerned only with the production of results, and became a tool to be used, and his legion became cogs in that machine. The wrath that he had in him was like a furnace at the base of an engine, and his advance was like that of a locomotive train. This change toward the machine, whereas at one time he was against the machine, can be said to be one of the corrupting aspects of Acernoth in effect on the Primarch and his mentality. Industriousness, as the aspect of humanity that Ferrus Manus embodies, has a few correspondences. The 10th Primarch was known for saying that his legion was not meant for rest, but to keep going, to keep moving, and to keep fighting, which is literally the definition of industriousness, but the word is sourced from industry, which is the processing of raw materials and goods, often in a factory environment. It's here that we start to see some of the themes of the 10th Legion. Even in the Legion's Terran history, the techno-barbarian nation-state of Old Albia was said to be a place of industry, consisting of towering, soot-blackened fortress cities whose warlike clans and implementation of machines made them a competent opponent to the Emperor's forces. In ancient Terran history, the period of time that could correspond with the nature of the 10th Primarch is the Industrial Revolution, a period in history in which machines were produced and used at a higher rate than ever before. This led to marvelous inventions and expanded the ability of humanity at the time, but it also led to a crisis in humanity in which people could not compete with the abilities of the machines being made. Ironically, the Industrial Revolution in Terra's ancient past began in ancient Albia. There will be some who say that industriousness is not an aspect of humanity, and I will counter that by saying all aspects of humanity are also aspects of civilization, as civilization is a human creation. Industriousness goes hand in hand with the progression of both humanity and civilization, which could not exist without constant maintenance from both within and without. Industriousness is the energy behind progress, and in a war effort such as that of the Great Crusade, industriousness is equal to vigilance and power. Ferrus Manus represented that power and embodied it as an aspect of humanity. Over time, the nature of the Legion began to change in a similar direction to their Primarch. Their commitment to strength became the abhorrence of weakness, to the point that the Imperial militia that were deployed with the Iron Tenth were treated more as cannon fodder, in a similar way to how the 4th Legion applied the human forces that fought beside them. The 10th became increasingly impatient with others and less understanding of their natural shortcomings, as to them, these things were weakness. As time went on, the 10th Legion became conquerors, fighting and acquiring territory for the Imperium with brute force. It's said that Manus cared little for the finer details of the Great Crusade and saw his legion's purpose as war, as expanding the boundary of the Imperium and crushing its enemies only. As Horus Lupercal enacted his rebellion against the Imperium and the Emperor, one of the Primarchs that sided with him was Fulgrim. Horus had assigned Fulgrim to try and sway Ferrus Manus to the side of the traitors, using the two Primarchs' long history of friendship as a base. Fulgrim went to Ferrus and tried to convince him to join the traitors, but Ferrus refused and was deeply angered by the offer. This would be the beginning of the conflict between the two that would end tragically during the Dropsite massacre of Istvan III. Ferrus Manus was the first Primarch to be killed in the Horus Heresy and was the first example of fratricide amongst the Primarch projects. Ferrus Manus was decapitated by Fulgrim during the Dropsite massacre of Istvan III, arguably one of the most catastrophic battles fought during the Horus Heresy. His death was tragic, it being at the hands of his favorite brother in an act of betrayal. But what was more tragic was that Ferrus Manus' death was not reacted to in the same way that Sanguinius' death would later be. There would be no statues of Ferrus Manus made throughout the Imperium, no day of celebration or mourning named after him. He would be killed and his body wouldn't even be recovered by his legion, who, sorely wounded by his loss, did not participate in the rest of the Horus Heresy. His body would instead be torn to pieces by the traitors, and pieces of him would be passed around for thousands of years. More than any other Primarch, Ferrus Manus was a tool, and when he was lost, it was a tool that was lost, not a Primarch. This was true for all but Fulgrim, who had been possessed when he killed Ferrus, Rabute Gilliman, who was said to have personally mourned the loss of Ferrus Manus as his most valuable ally, and the Emperor as well. It is commonly believed that the Emperor was able to summon the spirit of Ferrus Manus during his battle in the Webway, but this is not only untrue, but is a misinterpretation of what was actually happening, which was that the Emperor was weaponizing his sadness over all that had been lost up until that point against the demons of the warp, with the flames of his weapons suggesting the shape of his custodies and of Ferrus Manus. The effect that the death of their Primarch had on the 10th Legion was psychologically dark. The Iron Hands became filled with a powerful hate. Their hate was directed at the other legions that had fought in the Dropsite massacre, both at the Loyalists, who had begun to retreat instead of advancing toward the enemy, and the traitors for enacting their heresy. Their hate was directed at themselves for not protecting their Primarch. Their hate was even directed toward Ferrus himself, and after the Horus Heresy, the Emperor as well. They even began seeing humanity as being full of weakness, seeing them as a failure overall. Though Ferrus was confirmed to have been killed, after the Dropsite massacre, the Legion began to believe that their Primarch was not dead, simply because they did not find his body. Despite previous commitment to logic that the Legion was known for during the Great Crusade, these beliefs showed the power of their hate, for it had the strength to overcome reason within the Legion. In truth, Ferrus was torn apart by the traitors at Istvan, and his skull would be eventually taken by Horus Lupercal. The Iron Hands had somehow acquired one of Ferrus's arms and attempted to resurrect their Primarch, but this construct was destroyed by Vulcan as it was considered shameful. According to some sources, the traitor forces have also successfully cloned Ferrus Manus many times, but have had to destroy the clones due to the fact that they were all loyal. Eventually, The skull of Ferrus Manus was recovered from the forces of chaos and given back to the Iron Hands to convince them to break their legion into chapters and adhere to the new way of being under the Codex Astartes. His skull is said to be in the eye of Medusa and is ceaselessly watched over by a Hellfather or a bodyguard of the Iron Council. Even still, there are some Iron Hands who would believe that the Primarch will somehow return to them, and they await his arrival. Another manifestation of the Legion's hate after the massacre was their hatred of the flesh and their own physical bodies. The Legion as a whole would begin to modify their bodies, first replacing their hands with iron augmentations as a rite of passage. Then other parts of their bodies would also be replaced to increase their strength, effectiveness, and durability. The practice of body modification using mechanical augmentations was something that occurred previously in the Legion, but it increased significantly after Ferrus Manus' death. Despite their burning hatred, the Iron Hands remained loyal to the Imperium. The war cry of the Legion, which was split into chapters along with the other remaining loyalist legions, became "The flesh is weak," which might have been a deeper significance considering that one of the names of Ferrus Manus by the mechanical creatures of Medusa was the flesh. It also connects to the ideologies of the Mechanicus cult and the corrupting power of the Men of Iron. Where other Primarchs served as its herald, or its praetorian, or its protector, or its defender, the 10th Primarch Project was the engine of the Great Crusade. Destroying him did not stop the engine that is his legion and the chapters made from them, but it did destroy their sense of purpose. One of the goals of Ferrus Manus was to turn his legion once and for all from the ways of the machine once the fighting stopped and the Great Crusade was over. He also planned to remove his metal hands somehow and return to the mysteries of the flesh. The death of Ferrus Manus stopped that from ever happening and only gave his legion more fuel, as they were already driven by hate toward weakness, and betrayal is weakness in their eyes. As long as the traitors of the Imperium still stood, the engine that is the Iron Hands will continue without end ever forward to crush them. Perhaps it's not so delusional that the Iron Hands believe their Primarch not to be dead, even despite having his skull. Perhaps it is part of the machine-oriented mysticism of the Medusan clans to believe such. They are, after all, extensions of him and his will. They are named after him and endure his trials. They reside on Medusa and continue his legacy. For all intent and purpose, Ferrus Manus lives on, not only through the legion named after him, the Ferrus Manus or the Iron Hands, but through the spirits of the machine which continues to empower them. And we all know that the flesh is weak and that the machine is eternal. The Geneseed organ that I most associate with the 10th Primarch Project is the Biscopea. The Biscopea, also called the Forge of Strength, is the Geneseed organ that is implanted into the Astartes chest cavity early in the Geneseed implantation procedure. The basic purpose of the Biscopea is to release hormones that significantly increase the muscle mass and strength of an Astartes aspirant. This might seem contradictory, assigning the Geneseed organ of muscle increase to the 10th Primarch Project, given that Ferrus was known for his metal hands and his technological prowess. But before his metal hands, he had regular hands made of flesh and bone. That flesh and bone he was committed to strengthening and making tougher. Though there may have been larger and stronger Primarchs, Ferrus Manus was amongst the strongest of the Primarch projects before his silver hands, and this is why I attribute the Biscopea to Ferrus Manus and his legion. If not for their obsession with mechanical augmentations, which they feel makes them stronger, the 10th Legion would be the most naturally strongest of the legions of Adeptus Astartes, able to develop their physical bodies to the peak of development through constant application of tests of strength. And it is in this way that the Legion also strays even further, because it's not the machine that connects them to their Primarch, but the Geneseed, the flesh. And with that being said, that was my deep dive into the 10th Primarch Project, designated Ferrus Manus. Without anything else to be said, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects, and the future is successor.